A billionaire told his daughter she could choose any man in the room to be her husband, and the next words out of her mouth left an entire ballroom too stunned to breathe. The chandeliers above the Whitmore Grand Ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, casting golden light across polished marble floors and tables dressed in white linen and crystal. The wealth in that room was impossible to ignore. CEOs stood beside governors. Venture capitalists laughed over glasses of champagne. Men worth hundreds of millions of dollars exchanged handshakes beneath towering arrangements of white roses flown in from California that very morning. Every conversation carried the quiet confidence of people who had never worried about a mortgage payment or an overdue electric bill. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, one of the most powerful businessmen in America. At 68 years old, his silver hair was perfectly combed, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, and his reputation larger than the skyscrapers that carried his company's name. When Richard Whitmore spoke, people listened. When he entered a room, conversations paused. And tonight, every eye in the ballroom belonged to him. The orchestra softened. The room grew still. Richard lifted his champagne glass and smiled. "Thank you all for being here," he said. His voice carried easily through the hall. Tonight is not only a celebration of another successful year for Whitmore Holdings. It is also a celebration of family. A warm ripple of applause followed. Richard turned toward a woman standing near the front of the room. Charlotte Whitmore, 34 years old. Elegant without trying to be. Intelligent without needing to prove it. While others in her world chased attention, Charlotte seemed almost uncomfortable receiving it. Her dark blue gown reflected the chandelier light as she offered her father a polite smile. Richard's eyes softened for a moment. "My daughter has accomplished more than I ever dreamed possible," he continued. "She has led our charitable foundation, expanded our educational programs, and shown wisdom beyond her years." More applause. Charlotte nodded graciously, but something behind her smile seemed distant, thoughtful, as if her mind were somewhere else entirely. Richard raised his glass once more. "And now," he announced, "the time has come for Charlotte to think about the next chapter of her life." The crowd leaned forward. Several young executives exchanged hopeful glances. Everyone knew what was coming. For months, rumors had circulated through business circles and society pages. The billionaire's daughter would eventually choose a husband. Whoever won her heart would become part of one of the most powerful families in the country. Richard smiled confidently. "Charlotte," he said, extending a hand toward the room, "you may choose any man here." A nervous laugh swept through the ballroom. Several men straightened their jackets. Others adjusted their ties. One young tech founder nearly spilled his drink. Charlotte remained silent. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room, past the investors, past the politicians, past the wealthy heirs and polished executives. Her gaze continued moving until it reached the far edge of the ballroom. Somewhere nobody else was looking. Near a service entrance stood a man gathering empty plates onto a silver tray. He wore no designer suit, no expensive watch, no symbol of status, just a simple navy button-down shirt with sleeves rolled to his forearms. His name was Ethan Brooks. Most guests barely noticed him. To them, he was part of the background. One of those quiet people who made events run smoothly while everyone else enjoyed the spotlight. Ethan carefully stacked another plate. His movements were calm and deliberate. Across the room, Charlotte watched him for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Then a faint smile touched her lips. Richard followed her gaze. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. The orchestra had stopped completely now. Even the waitstaff seemed frozen. Somewhere deep beneath the elegance, beneath the polished speeches and practiced smiles, something unexpected had begun to move. And before the night was over, the lives of everyone in that ballroom would begin changing in ways none of them could yet imagine. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The soft clink of crystal glasses disappeared. The quiet conversations faded. Even the servers standing beside the wall seemed unsure whether to move. Charlotte Whitmore continued looking toward the far end of the ballroom, while dozens of wealthy guests followed her gaze. Ethan Brooks finally noticed the attention. He looked up from the tray in his hands and immediately felt the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Confusion crossed his face. He glanced behind himself, almost expecting someone else to be standing there. There was no one. Richard Whitmore's smile remained frozen. Not gone. Not broken. Just paused. like a man hearing something he did not expect to hear. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "I believe you may have misunderstood my question." A few nervous laughs fluttered through the crowd. Charlotte did not laugh. "I understood perfectly, Dad." Her voice was calm, gentle, certain. The room grew even quieter. Ethan set the tray down on a nearby service cart. He could feel heat rising into his face. Wealthy guests whispered behind raised hands. Several young executives exchanged bewildered looks. One investment banker chuckled under his breath. Another shook his head in disbelief. To them, Ethan Brooks was invisible. He was the kind of man people thanked without remembering his name. The kind of man who fixed things, carried things, cleaned up after celebrations, then quietly disappeared before sunrise. Nobody in that room could imagine why Charlotte Whitmore was looking at him the way she was now. Richard adjusted his cufflinks slowly. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately." Charlotte's eyes never left Ethan. "Why privately?" she asked softly. "Everything important has already been said publicly." A ripple of tension spread through the ballroom. Richard was a man accustomed to control. Boardrooms obeyed him. Investors trusted him. Politicians respected him. Yet for the first time all evening, he appeared uncertain. Ethan wished he could disappear. Not because he was ashamed. He simply hated being the center of attention. He preferred quiet places, simple conversations, honest work. This world of wealth and influence had never belonged to him. He took a small step backward. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "I think there has been some kind of mistake." His voice was steady despite the pressure surrounding him. Charlotte immediately turned toward him. Something softened in her expression. "There is no mistake, Ethan." The way she said his name surprised everyone. Not because she knew it, but because she said it like someone remembering a favorite song. Familiar, warm, genuine. Ethan looked away. The attention made him uncomfortable. Across the room, a few guests began quietly searching through their memories, trying to place him. Had they seen him before? Was he secretly someone important? A businessman in disguise? A retired celebrity? Surely there had to be an explanation. But there was none. Ethan Brooks lived in a modest two-bedroom house on the edge of town. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck with more miles than he cared to count. Most mornings began before sunrise and ended long after dark. Every dollar he earned had a destination before it reached his pocket. School supplies, groceries, utility bills, little things for Lily. Always Lily. While billionaires debated mergers and acquisitions, Ethan worried about whether his daughter preferred strawberry pancakes or blueberry pancakes on Saturday mornings. The contrast could not have been greater. Richard studied him carefully now. Not as staff, not as background, but as a man. The billionaire's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. He noticed Ethan's posture, the quiet confidence, the absence of desperation. Most people standing before Richard Whitmore wanted something. Money, influence, opportunity. Ethan seemed to want only an exit, and somehow that bothered Richard more than ambition would have. Near the orchestra platform, a society columnist whispered excitedly to a photographer. News traveled fast among powerful people. By tomorrow morning, rumors would spread across the country. The billionaire's daughter, the poor single father, the impossible choice. But Charlotte appeared completely unaffected by any of it. She simply stood there watching Ethan with a calm certainty that nobody else could understand. And somewhere deep inside Richard Whitmore's mind, a question began forming. Not who Ethan Brooks was, but why his daughter had chosen to see something in him that everyone else had somehow missed. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange kind of silence long after the music should have resumed. People smiled politely, but the smiles felt forced now. Conversations returned in fragments. Laughter sounded thinner. The evening had changed, and everyone knew it. Richard Whitmore eventually thanked his guests and invited them to enjoy the rest of the celebration. But even as people drifted back toward their tables, countless eyes continued following Ethan Brooks. The attention felt unbearable. He quietly excused himself and moved through a side corridor lined with framed photographs of Whitmore family achievements. The farther he walked from the ballroom, the easier it became to breathe. The distant sound of string music faded behind him. Soft evening air greeted him as he stepped onto a stone terrace overlooking the estate gardens. Beyond the perfectly trimmed hedges, thousands of tiny lights glowed across the property like stars scattered across the earth. Ethan rested his hands on the railing and closed his eyes for a moment. He had spent years building a life that was simple, predictable, peaceful. Tonight threatened all of that. You always disappear when things get complicated. Charlotte's voice came softly from behind him. Ethan opened his eyes. He did not look surprised to see her. Somehow he had sensed she would come. Charlotte walked toward the railing, her heels clicking gently against the stone. Up close, she looked different from the polished image the world knew. Less like a billionaire's daughter. More like a woman carrying thoughts she had hidden for a very long time. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The cool night breeze moved through the gardens below. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain whispered quietly into the darkness. Finally, Ethan sighed. Charlotte, this is not a good idea. She looked at him calmly. Which part? All of it. A faint smile touched her lips. That is not very specific. Ethan shook his head. People in that room think you have lost your mind. People in that room care too much about what other people think. Ethan could not argue with that. Charlotte folded her arms lightly. You are uncomfortable. You think. Ethan replied. An hour ago, nobody in that ballroom knew who I was. Now they are probably searching my entire life online. Charlotte laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh she had shared all evening. You are probably right. The sound faded, and silence returned. A comfortable silence. The kind that rarely existed between strangers. Ethan stared toward the distant lights. I do not belong in your world. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Maybe that is exactly why I trust you. Ethan frowned slightly. There it was again. That certainty. That strange confidence she seemed to have whenever she looked at him. As if she knew something nobody else did. Charlotte, he said carefully, we barely know each other. Her eyes lowered for just a moment. Maybe you think that. Before Ethan could respond, a memory surfaced unexpectedly inside her mind. 3 years earlier. Rain pouring across a crowded downtown street. Horns blaring. People rushing past without slowing down. A young woman standing alone beside a disabled car with water soaking through her coat. Frustrated. Exhausted. Invisible. Charlotte remembered that day clearly. Most people had walked past. One man had stopped. Not because she was wealthy. Not because she was beautiful. Not because he expected anything in return. He had simply seen someone who needed help. Ethan had never mentioned it since. In fact, he probably assumed she had forgotten. But she had not. Some acts of kindness stayed with a person long after the moment ended. Charlotte looked back at him now. You see yourself differently than other people do. Ethan gave a small shake of his head. No, I see myself exactly as I am. A man who works hard. A father who puts his daughter first. Someone who helps people when nobody is watching. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Compliments always embarrassed him. You make me sound better than I am. No, Charlotte said softly. I think the opposite happens. Before he could answer, the terrace doors opened behind them. Richard Whitmore stepped outside. The expression on his face was polite, controlled, and impossible to read. He looked first at Charlotte, then at Ethan. For a moment, nobody spoke. The billionaire approached slowly, his polished shoes crossing the stone patio with measured precision. When he finally stopped, his gaze remained fixed on Ethan. Mr. Brooks, Richard said calmly. Tomorrow morning, I would like to have breakfast with you. Ethan immediately sensed this was not an invitation. It was the beginning of something much larger. And judging by the look in Richard Whitmore's eyes, the billionaire had no intention of letting this mystery remain unsolved. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ethan lay awake in the small bedroom at the end of the hallway while moonlight spilled through the curtains and painted pale silver shapes across the floor. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of crickets outside. It was the kind of ordinary night he usually appreciated. The kind of night that reminded him how much peace mattered. But peace felt very far away now. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on the dresser. A younger version of himself stood beside his late wife, both smiling beneath a bright summer sky. Beside them was a tiny Lily, barely 2 years old, laughing at something beyond the camera. Ethan stared at the picture for a long time. Life had not unfolded the way he once imagined. There had been dreams, plans, ambitions. Then loss had arrived quietly and changed everything. Since then, his world had become smaller but more meaningful. Every choice revolved around one person, Lily. Nothing else had ever mattered as much. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The bedroom door opened slightly. Lily appeared wearing oversized pajamas covered with tiny stars. "Dad?" she whispered. Ethan smiled immediately. What are you doing awake? She walked into the room and climbed onto the edge of the bed. I heard you moving around. Ethan sighed softly. Could not sleep. Lily tilted her head. Is this about the rich people? A laugh escaped him despite himself. That obvious? Very obvious. She folded her arms with exaggerated seriousness. You have your worried face. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I have a worried face? Yep. She nodded confidently. You get it whenever the truck makes weird noises or when I bring home math homework. Ethan laughed again. The tension in his chest eased slightly. Lily studied him carefully. Are you in trouble? No. Are we moving? No. Did somebody yell at you? Ethan shook his head. Nothing like that. Lily relaxed. Good. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Because I like our house. Ethan looked around the modest room. The paint was slightly faded. The furniture had seen better days. The roof probably needed repairs before winter. Yet somehow it felt warmer than all the luxury he had witnessed that evening. I like it too, he said quietly. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and cool autumn air. By 8 o'clock, Ethan's pickup truck was traveling through the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate once again. Dew still clung to the sprawling lawns. Workers trimmed hedges with careful precision. Everything looked immaculate. Controlled. Perfect. A sharp contrast to the unpredictable messiness of real life. Ethan parked near the main entrance and stepped out. He wore his cleanest button-down shirt and a dark jacket. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. Just himself. A uniformed attendant guided him through the enormous home toward a private breakfast room overlooking a lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with morning light. Fresh coffee filled the air. Richard Whitmore was already seated at the table. The billionaire looked less like a public figure this morning and more like a father carrying a burden. Thank you for coming, Richard said. Ethan nodded politely. You asked. Richard gestured toward the empty chair. Please. For a few moments they exchanged small talk. Coffee was poured. Breakfast was served. Neither man touched much of it. Both knew why they were really there. Finally, Richard folded his napkin and leaned back. Mr. Brooks, I spent part of last night learning everything I could about you. Ethan had expected that. And Richard's expression remained unreadable. You were surprisingly difficult to understand. Ethan almost smiled. Most people think I am pretty simple. That is exactly the problem. Richard folded his hands together. Your records show no scandals. No lawsuits. No hidden debts. No strange investments. No attempts to profit from my daughter's attention. He paused. In today's world, that is unusual. Ethan stared out toward the lake for a moment. Gentle ripples moved across the water beneath the cloudy sky. I am just trying to raise my daughter. Richard studied him carefully. Most men claim that family comes first. And very few actually mean it. The room fell quiet again. Somewhere outside, geese drifted across the lake. The silence stretched. Not hostile. Not comfortable. Something in between. Then Richard reached into a leather folder beside him and placed a document on the table. He slid it slowly toward Ethan. I would like to make you an offer. Ethan looked down at the paper but did not touch it. Something in Richard's tone immediately told him this was not an ordinary business proposal. The billionaire's eyes remained fixed on him. Calm. Serious. Determined. And for the first time since entering the estate, Ethan felt the true weight of what was beginning. The document rested quietly between them. A single sheet of paper. Thin. Ordinary. Yet somehow it felt heavier than everything else in the room. Ethan glanced down at it, but made no effort to read it. Richard Whitmore remained still, watching him carefully. Outside the massive windows, gray clouds drifted slowly across the morning sky. The lake beyond remained calm, its surface reflecting the muted light like polished steel. You are not even going to look at it? Richard asked. Ethan folded his hands together. I would rather hear it from you. For the first time that morning, something resembling respect flickered across the billionaire's face. Most people would have lunged for the paper immediately. They would have searched for numbers. Conditions. Opportunities. Ethan simply waited. Richard exhaled slowly. The proposal is straightforward. He paused. I am willing to provide you with financial security. Ethan's expression did not change. Define financial security. Richard almost smiled. A new home. A trust fund for Lily's education. More than enough money to ensure neither of you ever worry about bills again. Silence followed. The offer hung in the air. For many people, it would have sounded like a miracle. Ethan stared at the lake. He thought about overdue repairs on the truck, rising grocery prices, the college savings account that never seemed to grow quickly enough. He thought about the sacrifices that came with raising a child alone. The offer should have been tempting. Instead, a strange sadness settled over him. And what do you want in return? Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. I appreciate direct people. Then answer the question. Another long silence. Finally, Richard spoke. Distance. Ethan looked back at him. Distance. From Charlotte. The room felt colder somehow. Richard leaned forward slightly. You seem like a decent man, Mr. Brooks. That is not the issue. Then what is? Richard's jaw tightened. The issue is reality. Ethan said nothing. The billionaire continued. My daughter lives under constant scrutiny. Every decision she makes becomes public discussion. Every relationship becomes a headline. Every mistake becomes entertainment for strangers. He paused. You may think this is about money. It is not. Ethan listened carefully. Richard's voice carried genuine concern now. Not arrogance. Not hostility. Concern. Charlotte has spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, Richard said. Some wanted influence. Others wanted status. Others wanted access to our family name. He looked directly into Ethan's eyes. I cannot tell whether you are different. Ethan nodded slowly. Fair enough. Richard appeared surprised by the response. That is all. What else should I say? Ethan asked. You do not know me. Exactly. The billionaire sat back in his chair. Then help me understand. Ethan looked out the window again. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Ethan reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded photograph. The edges were worn from years of handling. He placed it carefully on the table. Richard glanced down. The picture showed Ethan and Lily standing beside an old Christmas tree. The decorations were mismatched. The living room looked modest. Yet both were smiling so widely it almost hurt to look at. That is my life, Ethan said quietly. Not my house. Not my job. Her. Richard studied the photo. You love your daughter. Ethan almost laughed. More than I know how to explain. The billionaire remained silent. Ethan continued. Every decision I make starts with one question. Which is, will this help Lily? The words landed differently than Richard expected. They carried no performance. No attempt to impress. Just simple truth. Ethan folded the photograph and returned it to his wallet. You think I am chasing something? Are you? Richard asked. Ethan shook his head. The truth is, I have spent most of this week wishing none of this happened. The billionaire blinked. Why? Ethan smiled faintly. Because my life was already full. Those words lingered between them. Richard had negotiated billion-dollar deals. He had sat across from presidents and industry leaders. Yet somehow that simple sentence unsettled him more than any argument could have. Before either man could speak again, the breakfast room door opened. Charlotte entered carrying a folder beneath one arm. She stopped when she sensed the tension. Her eyes moved from her father to Ethan. Am I interrupting? Richard immediately straightened. The careful walls around his emotions returned. Not at all. Charlotte looked unconvinced. She had known her father her entire life. She recognized that expression. The controlled voice. The measured posture. Something important had happened before she arrived. Ethan rose politely from his chair. Good morning. Charlotte smiled warmly. Good morning. Richard watched the exchange carefully. The smile on his daughter's face appeared effortless. Natural. Different from the practiced smiles she often wore at corporate events. And for the first time, a troubling possibility entered his mind. What if the real danger was not that Ethan wanted something from Charlotte? What if Charlotte had already begun caring about him far more deeply than anyone realized? Charlotte remained standing near the breakfast table, sensing the invisible tension that lingered in the room long after the conversation had paused. Sunlight filtered through the towering windows behind her, casting pale reflections across the polished floor. The lake outside remained calm, but inside the room, emotions were moving beneath the surface like unseen currents. Richard rose from his chair first. I have a board meeting in 20 minutes, he said. His voice had returned to its usual polished authority. Charlotte, perhaps you could show Mr. Brooks the property before he leaves. Charlotte glanced toward Ethan. I would like that. Ethan opened his mouth to politely decline, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the sincerity in her eyes. Maybe it was the realization that avoiding this situation was becoming impossible. Richard noticed the hesitation. Good, he said simply. Then he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked back at Ethan. "We will continue our discussion later." The words sounded polite. The meaning beneath them was not. After the door closed, silence settled over the room once more. Charlotte exhaled softly. "That went well." Ethan laughed under his breath. "Your definition of well is different from mine." "Probably." For the first time all morning, they both smiled. An hour later, they were walking through the estate gardens beneath a sky that had finally begun to clear. Autumn sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Leaves drifted lazily across stone pathways. The air smelled faintly of pine and fresh earth. The estate stretched for hundreds of acres, yet Charlotte seemed completely uninterested in showing off any of it. Instead of discussing the property, she kept asking questions about Lily. What books did she like? What was her favorite subject? What did she want to be when she grew up? Ethan answered cautiously at first, then more naturally. Soon he found himself talking about things he rarely shared with anyone. "Last month she decided she wanted to learn astronomy," he said. "So now our backyard has become an observatory." Charlotte laughed. "Seriously?" "Every clear night." Ethan shook his head affectionately. "She points at stars and asks questions I cannot answer." "And what do you do?" "Pretend I know what I am talking about." Charlotte laughed again. The sound seemed effortless, genuine. Ethan found himself relaxing despite everything. They reached a small footbridge overlooking a narrow stream winding through the property. Charlotte rested her hands on the railing. "You know," she said quietly, "you never talk about yourself." Ethan looked down at the moving water. "Not much to talk about." "That is not true." He shrugged. "I work. I pay bills. I try not to burn dinner." "And before that?" Charlotte asked. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. The change was subtle, but she noticed it immediately. A shadow crossed his eyes. "Not pain exactly. Memory." "Before what?" "Before life became about survival." For several moments Ethan said nothing. Wind rustled through the trees above them. Somewhere nearby a bird called out from a branch. Finally he sighed. "There was a time when things looked different." Charlotte waited patiently. Ethan rarely volunteered personal stories. She understood that. Some people talked to fill silence. Others protected it. "I studied architecture," he said. "A long time ago." Charlotte blinked. "Architecture?" Ethan nodded. "I love designing things. Buildings. Community spaces. Schools. You never mentioned that." "Nobody asks." Charlotte stared at him. Another piece of the puzzle had appeared. Another contradiction. The more she learned about Ethan Brooks, the less he fit into the simple image everyone had assigned him. "What happened?" she asked gently. Ethan looked toward the horizon. The answer took time to come. Life happened. There was no bitterness in his voice. No anger. Just acceptance. The kind earned through years of carrying burdens quietly. Charlotte wanted to ask more. She wanted to understand every chapter he never spoke about. But before she could continue, the distant sound of tires crunching along gravel interrupted them. Both turned. A black luxury sedan was approaching through the estate road. Then another followed. And another. Ethan frowned. Expecting company? Charlotte's expression changed. The warmth disappeared from her face. Concern replaced it. She immediately recognized the vehicles. "No," she said softly. "Not company." The first sedan stopped near the main house. Several people stepped out carrying briefcases and folders. Lawyers. Advisors. Senior executives from Whitmore Holdings. Ethan noticed the tension in Charlotte's posture. "What is it?" Charlotte kept her eyes fixed on the arriving vehicles. "Whenever my father gathers that many lawyers in one place," she said quietly, "it means he has made a decision." A chill passed through Ethan despite the sunlight. Across the estate, more vehicles continued arriving through the gates. One after another. Silent. Purposeful. Whatever Richard Whitmore was planning, it was growing larger than a private conversation. And for the first time since this strange journey began, Charlotte looked genuinely worried. Charlotte did not waste a second. She turned away from the bridge and started walking toward the main house with quick, determined steps. Ethan followed beside her, sensing the growing tension without fully understanding it. The estate that had seemed peaceful only minutes earlier now felt different. The arriving sedans lined the circular driveway like silent messengers carrying news no one wanted to hear. Men and women in dark suits moved purposefully through the entrance carrying portfolios, tablets, and thick folders. Nobody appeared relaxed. Nobody appeared casual. Whatever Richard Whitmore had set into motion, It was important enough to pull senior executives away from their schedules on almost no notice. As they approached the house, Charlotte slowed slightly. My father only gathers legal teams when he believes something is threatening the future of the company. Ethan glanced at her. And you think I am that threat? Charlotte stopped walking. The question hurt more than she expected. No. Her answer came instantly. But he may. Ethan looked toward the mansion. The enormous building seemed less welcoming than it had that morning. Less like a home and more like a fortress protecting something valuable. Then maybe I should leave. Charlotte stared at him. Would you? Ethan hesitated. The honest answer was complicated. Every instinct told him to return to his normal life. To his house. To Lily. To the familiar rhythm of work and responsibility. Yet another part of him understood that leaving now would not solve anything. The story had already escaped into the world. Too many people were watching. Too many questions had been asked. I do not know, he admitted. Charlotte studied his face. There was no ambition there. No excitement about being connected to wealth or influence. Only uncertainty. And somehow that made everything more difficult. Inside the mansion, activity had intensified. Staff moved quickly through hallways. Assistants carried stacks of documents between conference rooms. Phones rang constantly. Ethan felt completely out of place. He belonged in workshops and school auditoriums, not among billion-dollar decisions and corporate strategy meetings. As they crossed the main foyer, a familiar voice interrupted them. Mr. Brooks. Ethan turned. A woman in her early 60s approached from the opposite hallway. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. Her posture carried quiet authority. Charlotte immediately smiled. Margaret. The woman nodded warmly. Miss Whitmore. Then she turned toward Ethan. I have been hoping to meet you. Ethan looked confused. Have we met before? Margaret smiled. Not officially. She extended her hand. Margaret Ellis. I have worked for this family for 32 years. Ethan shook her hand politely. There was something unusual about the way she looked at him. Not curiosity. Not judgment. Something closer to approval. Charlotte noticed it too. Margaret rarely likes anyone, she teased. The older woman laughed softly. That is not true. Then she looked directly at Ethan. I simply learned long ago that character matters more than reputation. The words lingered. Before Ethan could respond, another assistant approached Margaret and quietly handed her a folder. She glanced at the contents. Her expression shifted slightly. Concern replaced amusement. Charlotte, she said carefully, your father wants everyone in the West conference room within 15 minutes. Charlotte frowned. Everyone. Margaret nodded. Everyone. After she walked away, Ethan noticed Charlotte's face pale slightly. What does that mean? He asked. Charlotte looked toward the far end of the hallway. It means this is no longer private. 15 minutes later, the West conference room was nearly full. Senior executives occupied one side of the massive table. Lawyers filled another. Financial advisors sat reviewing documents. Large screens glowed softly along the walls, displaying company data and projections. Ethan felt completely out of place among them. He chose a chair near the back of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed. It did not work. Every few minutes, someone glanced in his direction. Some with curiosity, some with skepticism, some with open disapproval. Then the doors opened. Richard Whitmore entered. Instantly, the room fell silent. The billionaire carried a thin folder beneath one arm. Nothing about his expression revealed what he was thinking. He moved to the head of the table and placed the folder down carefully. The room waited. Richard looked around at every face. Then his gaze briefly settled on Ethan, just long enough to be noticed. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, he began. His voice was calm but firm. This meeting concerns the future stability of Whitmore Holdings and certain developments that have attracted significant public attention. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Richard opened the folder. The sound of paper turning seemed unusually loud in the silent room. Then he removed a single document and held it in his hand. Whatever was written there immediately changed the atmosphere. Charlotte saw it first. Her eyes widened. Richard remained expressionless. But for the first time since this began, even he looked troubled by what he was about to say. The conference room felt smaller with every passing second. Dozens of successful men and women sat perfectly still, waiting for Richard Whitmore to continue. The giant screens along the walls glowed softly. The air conditioning hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang briefly before falling silent again. Yet inside the room, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard held the document in his hand, as though he wished it contained different words. Charlotte watched him closely. She had spent her entire life reading her father's expressions. She knew when he was angry. She knew when he was confident. She knew when he was hiding fear behind discipline. And right now, she saw something she had not expected. Doubt. Richard cleared his throat. Over the last 48 hours, he began. Public attention surrounding recent events has created significant discussion among shareholders, investors, and members of the board. A few executives shifted uneasily in their chairs. Richard continued. Several major stakeholders have expressed concern regarding leadership stability and future succession planning. The words sounded corporate, clean, professional, but everyone understood what he was really saying. Charlotte's decision had become a problem. Ethan remained silent near the back of the room. He wanted nothing more than to leave. Every sentence seemed to pull him deeper into a world he never asked to enter. Richard lowered the document slightly. This morning I received a formal recommendation from several members of the board. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. What recommendation? Richard looked at her. The pause lasted only a moment. They believe your public association with Mr. Brooks may damage investor confidence. Silence followed. Cold, heavy silence. Several executives immediately looked away. Nobody wanted to meet Charlotte's eyes. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger. Disappointment. He had expected resistance. He had not expected to become a risk assessment on someone's spreadsheet. Charlotte stood slowly. So this is about stock prices. Richard's voice remained calm. It is about responsibility. Responsibility? Her tone sharpened. You are talking about a human being. The room grew even quieter. Richard did not answer immediately. Charlotte took a breath. Have any of these people actually spoken to Ethan? Nobody responded. Have any of them spent 5 minutes getting to know him? More silence. The answer was obvious. They had studied reports, background checks, financial histories, but not the man himself. Charlotte looked around the room. The faces surrounding her represented power, influence, and wealth. Yet in that moment, they seemed strangely small. You judged him without knowing him. An older executive finally spoke. Miss Whitmore, with respect, this is not personal. Charlotte laughed softly. There was no humor in it. That is exactly the problem. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. Something about the conversation was affecting him more than he expected. Because beneath all the reports and projections, he knew Charlotte was not entirely wrong. Across the room, Ethan quietly rose from his chair. Every head turned toward him. Mr. Brooks, one lawyer began. Perhaps it would be helpful if you... Ethan raised a hand gently. Not to interrupt, simply to speak. The room fell silent once more. You do not need to explain anything, he said. His voice remained calm. Steady. I understand. Charlotte immediately turned toward him. No. Ethan met her eyes. There was kindness there. Sadness too. Charlotte. She shook her head. Do not do that. But Ethan already knew what he was going to say. He looked around the room, filled with people who measured risk for a living. Then he looked at Richard. Your company matters to thousands of families. Richard remained silent. Ethan continued. Employees, retirees, communities. He paused. I would never want to become the reason any of that suffers. The words landed harder than anyone expected, because they were not strategic. They were sincere. Charlotte's eyes filled with frustration. Why are you defending them? Ethan offered a small smile. Because not everything is about winning. Those words seemed to stop time itself. Richard stared at him. Several executives lowered their eyes. Even the lawyers appeared uncomfortable. For years they had negotiated with people who demanded more, fought harder, pushed louder. Yet here stood a man who cared more about other people's stability than his own position. And somehow that made the situation infinitely more complicated. Then the conference room doors opened unexpectedly. Margaret Ellis entered carrying a thick archive box in both hands. Her face looked unusually serious. Richard, she said quietly. Every eye turned toward her. She approached the table and carefully placed the box down beside him. Dust clung faintly to the cardboard edges. It looked old, forgotten, important. Richard frowned. What is this? Margaret hesitated. Something I found this morning while reviewing family archives. The room waited. Margaret looked first at Charlotte, then at Ethan. Finally, she turned back to Richard. I believe you need to see what is inside before making any decisions. For the first time all day, genuine uncertainty crossed Richard Whitmore's face. Slowly, He reached toward the box, and as his fingers touched the lid, an uneasy feeling spread through the room. Because whatever had been hidden inside those old records was powerful enough to make Margaret interrupt one of the most important meetings in company history. The conference room remained perfectly still as Richard Whitmore lifted the lid of the archive box. Dust floated briefly through the sunlight pouring in from the tall windows. Inside were old folders, photographs, handwritten notes, and records dating back years. Richard frowned as he carefully removed the first file. Margaret stood quietly beside him. Her hands were folded in front of her, but there was a tension in her posture that everyone noticed. She knew what was inside. Richard did not. Slowly he opened the folder. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then a third. The color drained from his face. Charlotte noticed it immediately. "Dad." Richard did not answer. The room waited. A strange silence settled over everyone. Finally, Richard reached deeper into the file and removed an old photograph. The edges were worn with age. He stared at it for several long seconds. Then he looked up at Ethan. Not with suspicion, not with doubt. Something else. Something closer to shock. "Where did you find this?" he asked Margaret quietly. "In the family archive room," she replied. It had been misfiled for years. Richard looked back down at the photograph. His hand trembled slightly. The billionaire who never appeared shaken now seemed unable to find words. Charlotte stepped closer. "What is it?" Richard slowly turned the photograph toward her. Charlotte stared. In the picture, taken many years earlier, stood a much younger Ethan beside emergency responders near a damaged roadside vehicle. The image was old, grainy, and imperfect, but the faces were unmistakable. Ethan blinked in confusion. He had not seen that photograph in years. Richard's voice became almost a whisper. "I remember this day." The room remained silent. Richard looked at Ethan again. 20 years ago, my car left the road during a storm." Ethan's eyes widened slightly as the memory returned. Rain. Darkness. A dangerous curve on a mountain road. A younger version of himself stopping without hesitation. Richard continued. "Before help arrived, someone stayed with me for nearly 2 hours in freezing rain." Charlotte looked between them. The realization slowly formed. Richard lowered his eyes. "That someone was you." Nobody spoke. The executives, the lawyers, the advisors. Every person in the room sat frozen. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "It was a long time ago." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "You knew who I was?" Ethan nodded once. "Eventually. And you never contacted me?" "No." Richard looked genuinely confused. "Why?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "You needed help. That was all." The simplicity of the answer seemed to hit the room harder than any speech could have. Years earlier, Ethan had saved one of the most powerful men in the country from a dangerous situation. He had asked for nothing. No reward. No favor. No recognition. He had simply gone home and continued living his life. Richard sat down slowly. The document from the board remained forgotten beside him. The objections. The concerns. The forecasts. Suddenly, they felt very small. He looked around the conference room at the people who had spent days analyzing Ethan's finances, background, and social standing. Yet none of them had discovered the most important thing about him. Character. Quiet character. The kind that asks for nothing and expects nothing. Richard rose again and walked around the table. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He stopped directly in front of Ethan. For a moment, the billionaire simply looked at him. Then he extended his hand. "Mr. Brooks," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." Ethan looked surprised. Richard continued. "I spent days trying to determine whether you were worthy of my daughter's trust." His voice wavered slightly. "The truth is, you proved your character long before any of us knew your name." Complete silence filled the room. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that arrives when pride finally steps aside and truth is allowed to speak. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. Richard turned toward the executives. "This discussion is over." Nobody argued. Nobody objected. They simply understood. Some lowered their heads. Others looked away. The judgment that had seemed so certain only hours earlier now felt embarrassingly shallow. Weeks later, on a bright autumn afternoon, a small gathering took place beneath golden trees near the lake. There were no television cameras, no corporate announcements, no grand displays of wealth. Just family, friends, and people who genuinely cared. Lily stood between Charlotte and Ethan, smiling so brightly it seemed impossible not to smile with her. The little girl who once worried about homework and pancakes now held both their hands, as if she had known all along how the story would end. Richard watched from nearby. Peace had replaced the worry in his eyes. Not because everything was perfect, but because he had finally learned something money could never buy. The value of a person is not measured by status, wealth, or titles. It is measured by what they do when nobody is watching. As the sun dipped lower across the water, Charlotte looked at Ethan and smiled. Ethan smiled back, quietly, gratefully, without triumph, without pride, just dignity, the kind that never needed applause. And if this story reminded you that kindness still matters, that character still matters, and that sometimes the richest person in the room is the one who asks for nothing at all, share your thoughts below. We would love to hear where you are watching from. And if stories of grace, second chances, and quiet strength speak to your heart, consider subscribing so we can continue sharing journeys like this one together.